She is ready. So good to see all of you tonight. This is a little different. Thanks for being flexible. Last week we were out in the Commons and had a good turnout of you guys. And several people called and said, "Can we get the notes online? And are you going to record this in case I miss one?" And so we decided to swap. Is that all right? Only problem is in here I need more technical crew, and they're all elsewhere doing other things. So we'll figure it out. You guys can come join me if you want. Otherwise, you'll just see my ear. Because ever since I broke my neck, I can't turn left very well. So, so you're welcome to come. And I know, she who shall remain nameless will not move over here no matter what I tell her to do. But you are welcome to come in and join us. Good to see everybody tonight. How's everybody doing? I just got back from a conference. We had a conference this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and such a full week. You drive down to Eugene on Monday. Monday night they had a service and got to see a lot of old friends. I mean, some old friends and a lot of newer ones. And then Wednesday we started it. The first meeting was 8:30 in the morning and it ended about 9 at night. And there was no breaks. There was a lunch break, but we never left. We started off with a missions meeting for the Northwest. So in part, I got to share a little report from our missions gathering down in Dominican Republic. But the highlight was, and then, there was a workshop with my pastor before I came here. And it was on mental health. And he's not one that comes to a lot of conferences. So literally, I think since I left 30 years ago, I think I've seen him twice. And one was in Israel in 2007, and the other one was at this conference. So that was fun. And then last night, we had 3 staff people. Thank you, Nadine. Tim and Nadine are doing their own workshop, and they're here helping me with mine. And thank you very much. I appreciate it. I don't think I need anything else, so you're all on your own. Thank you, Nadine. So we had 3 of our staff people get ordained. So in Foursquare, you get, when you enter into licensure in Foursquare to become an official, quote-unquote, licensed pastor, you get a district license. And it used to be there was 3 steps, then you got an international license. Now it's just district license, and after you've served for at least 2 years with your district license, and all 3 have, but Tim and Nadine and Pastor Abel all got ordained last night. So that's the last official full-blown licensure. That's the highest licensure that we have. And so we got to pray over them and anoint them, and several people. Carol came down. It was great. And several people came down to join us. And Marty, what are you doing? You know the deal. It's right over here, brother. Come on now. I can't see over there, remember? So, thanks, brother. Here, scoot it that way, and then he can get it. Thank you. And if you want to, you can, little orphan Annie. So it was just great and emotionally exhausting. And then I drove home today, and now I'm ready. So I'm excited to be here tonight. But what a night. Also, so I had 3 of my staff get ordained last night. But also my wife, Molly, got her 25-year pin. So that's a big deal. That means she's been licensed and ordained for 25 years. I got mine several years back, and what an accomplishment. You know, there was, I think, about a dozen people in our district who got their 25-year pin last night, and what a deal. So that's where I've been for the last 48 hours, and so what a great night to be together with you. I hope it's a little more comfortable in here. My thought is this, tell me what you think. Last week I took avid notes on all of your questions, and I will too if you have continuing questions. I mean, I took down and spent a lot of time kind of outlining out how we want these next 8 or 9 weeks to go, however many are left until we take the Christmas break. And so most of my lessons are kind of based on a question. Based on the peace in the Middle East. So one of the key questions that I came away with last night that I'd like to, and I don't even know if it's too much to say, you have the question, and now I'm going to give you the answer. I'm going to ask you the question back. I'm going to let that question be kind of a topic of discussion. And that when it comes to the Middle East is, when did it all begin? What started this whole thing? You know, remember last week I used the illustration of the Hatfields and the McCoys? It's really so apt, because it's one of those things where both sides hate each other, and truth be told, unless they've taken a lot of history classes, most of the modern generation or the kids growing up, nobody knows where it started. Now, I'm not saying there aren't abundance of theories or there aren't slogans, you know, just like we'll throw out, remember the Alamo, right? Remember the Alamo? Remember? You don't remember the Alamo. You've been told stories about the Alamo, but does it inspire, you know, hatred towards the Mexicans or whatever? Yeah, you get it. So remember the Alamo was fighting words for some people at one point, was a rallying cry, right? But so there are people that will say, oh, but, you know, this or that. What, just off the top of your head, and I hope this doesn't just shut down all discussion because we're doing this thing where we're looking. Oh, man. But where do you think the conflict started? Like if your kids were to ask you, Dad, why are these people bombing each other? Is there anybody that wants to work the microphone tonight? Be Mr. Microphone, like it's a talk show, like it's Sally Jesse Raphael? You could be. Really dates me, doesn't it? How long has she been off TV? I can't remember. Thanks. Anybody want to shoot? Your kids ask you, where did this all begin? What's your best guess? This is a no wrong answer section of the evening, by the way. What do you think?
Mine?
Sure.
My best guess would be let my people go, but I'm sure I'm wrong.
Let the what?
Let my people go.
Oh, way back in Egypt, when well, Israel's coming out of Egypt. Wow, that's way back to the beginning. That's good. Marty, what do you think?
Well, two of us said Esau and Jacob.
Yeah?
Wow. I mean, you know, and what did Esau, didn't he marry Ishmael's daughter? So he got the double whammy. So.
Jacob and Esau. So they were the two brothers. Remind everybody. And for those of us that aren't Bible scholars, like
Esau, I hated the whole thing. Jacob was out of the son of promise, come out of the son of promise, and his name became Israel. And Esau, well, he just became Esau.
And he became Esau, right? So what are there other patriarch stories? So if it's Jacob and Esau, so who is Esau in that story then? Jacob is Israel. Who's Esau?
He's the son of a bond slave. Or I mean, I'm thinking.
You are, I know.
Yeah.
But it's not your fault, Marty. It's not your fault. You just wandered in on a Wednesday night and I'm asking you Bible questions. And it's not your fault. I'm going to tell you why. Because I get confused between those two stories too. And it's really easy because I think they're one of those, remember I've talked about the layers? Mm-hmm. I think they're layer stories. So there's things about those stories, even with Abraham and Sarah. I mean, which one sold their wife or gave their wife to a king? Like two of them did. So it's like, okay, which stories are which? So you're right. There's Jacob is the father of the Israelites. Esau is the father of whom? Does anybody know? Is the Edomites.
Okay.
So the nation of Edom. And so whenever that story between Jacob and Esau fighting like this, there's a little bit of a polemic for later generations about why the Israelites hate the Edomites. And it's a little bit, well, you know, they shouldn't have sold their birthright for a bowl of lentil stew. That's why we hate the Edomites, thinking Edomites. And they didn't come and help us when the Babylonians attacked. So, yeah, and you tapped on another one. Who is the son of the slave? Did you have the answer back there in the back?
Well, I was going to go with Abraham having both Isaac and Ishmael.
Abraham what?
Having both Isaac and Ishmael.
Okay, tell me the story. Why is that the conflict of Abraham?
Well, I think Ishmael became the father of the Islamic people, right? And then Isaac is still in the line of, the Christian.
Okay, so
or Jewish people.
In that story, so if you remember the biblical story, right? Abraham was promised children, and yet Sarah was not able to have children, and so he gives he has children instead. With Sarah's instruction and permission, by the way, my wife would and never has given me such instruction. Why don't you go have, take my handmaid, and have a wife, have kids through there. And keep in mind too, this does not fly today, but in ancient cultures, stuff like that was done from time to time. So anyway, he has a son named Ishmael through Hagar. And then eventually there's jealousy that erupts, and Sarah is actually able to have her own son, who is Isaac. He's the child of promise, and eventually she gets jealous and she says, get rid of that slave woman and her son. And once again, in both cases, God tells Abraham, do whatever she tells you. So he does. And then she goes off into the wilderness, and then God shows up to Hagar. You guys are all okay, all right. I'll just hedge the bets. Hagar and Ishmael. God shows up to Hagar and Ishmael and says, don't worry about it. I'm going to make you into a great nation too. And so it's this kind of mysterious. What's the origin of that story? Do I have any more?
I need to go make more.
Fine. I don't need the notes. Donna, not for a long time. I can go off the slides, so that's fine. Thank you, Donna. And so, okay, so not only do you say that Ishmael is the source of it, but you know where else it says that? In the Quran. So in the Quran, which was written in the 7th century AD, so if Abraham lived 1800 BC, in 620 AD, the Prophet Muhammad dictates the Quran, and then it's written down a few generations later. And in the Quran, the Arabic people claim to be the descendants of Ishmael. And so they make that connection. The Quran was meant to be like a stage 3 to the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Quran didn't set out to try to desecrate or argue against those. It was like we have the New Testament that's added onto the Hebrew Bible. And we're not trying to desecrate the Old Testament. The Quran was meant to be a stage 3. In their mind, the Prophet Muhammad had a vision, and it's stage 3. So there's a lot about Abraham, and Jonah is a big deal in there, and Ishmael. So that's their tradition, as it goes all the way back to God promising Abraham a great nation, but also one to Hagar. And one of the names that I didn't use in the names of God, and I might come back and touch on it, but one of the names he said, and she builds an altar and calls that place El Roi, which means God sees me. Interesting. But once again, the Arab people are not mentioned in that story. That's just an after the fact connection that Muslims make back to the Bible. Anybody else? Where did it start? Anybody think it started more recently? Let's go back to the Bible. And it started all the way back in the pages of the Old Testament. All right, so I might be an outlier, but I'm going to start with the Bible. And here's how much I knew what you were going to say tonight, because I knew you were going to, some of your questions. Doesn't this go all the way back to the Bible? I said, okay. The answer to that, yes or no, is really an opinion statement. When did this all begin? It's like whose fault is World War II, right? Well, we know whose fault it is. No, but a lot of things went into it. But there are roots of it that go all the way back to the ancient world. And part of it is just this. Part of the Hebrew Bible, and one of the major themes, was that when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, there were Canaanites living there, and God promised them that land. He said, I'm going to promise you all of this land. Well, they didn't occupy the whole land until they went down into Egypt, became a greater nation. I'm telling you the story of the Bible. And then they came up out in the Exodus, and then it took 40 years, and then bit by bit they took over the land, and so on and so forth. And eventually they became a kingdom. And so in a couple of...
Somebody's Ford Taurus wagon?
Anybody have a Ford Taurus wagon? I want to make sure the lights are off. People ask me, do your lights go off automatically? I say eventually. Eventually they all do. I think all my cars do it, but I've been telling that joke since before they did. Anyway, so Ishmael, any other points of origin in the Bible that you wanted to go back to? All right. So what I'd like to do is I want to show you a bunch of I have a lot of maps, but I started with 40 and I have like 20. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all of these. I have done in years past. I've done a couple of swipes at the Crescent and the Cross series, but I'm a visual learner. The reason I sat down to make some of these maps is because I think until you see the maps and you see how the population shifted, it's easy to just go from Bible. So who are the enemies in the Bible? Who are the bad guys? What'd you say? Romans. During Jesus' time, they were the Romans, weren't they? Who else are the bad guys? The Philistines. Those dirty Philistines. Who else? Syrians, the Babylonians at various times. What? The Persians, sometimes they were great friends. By the way, say that about all of them. All of those people groups that you just mentioned, at points in the Bible are allies, and at points in time are enemies. And so the question is, who are the enemies in the Bible? It depends on what layer you are. You know, we're great friends with the Japanese right now. We weren't a few years back. Anybody remember Pearl Harbor? Right? We weren't friends with them now. Now we're just, I ate sushi last night before I went to bed. So what happened? What happened is time happened. And so the Bible is a four-dimensional book. It's not just very real and attached to the real world, but it's written over time. And so here's this one phrase in Ezekiel when he gets through delineating out what are the boundaries that I've promised to you, Abraham. He also says, you are to distribute this land among yourselves according to the tribes of Israel, and you are to allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the foreigners residing among you and who have children. You are to consider them as native-born Israelites along with you, and they are to be allotted on the inheritance among the tribes of Israel. In whatever tribe a foreigner resides, there you are to give them their inheritance, declares the sovereign Lord. That's an interesting passage, isn't it? So this is Ezekiel. This is late. This is during or after the exile. So the apportioning of the land. In fact, I'm convinced a lot of the, you know how I kind of look for layers, like when was this written? A lot of the things that have to do with apportioning the land and returning and taking over the land, and I've promised you this land, the story is in the time of the Exodus and of Moses and Joshua, but they were told again in that return from exile. And so Ezekiel was a post-exile prophet or during exile prophet, telling them when you get back there, you don't have to kill off everybody, just apportion the land according to how I said it, and then live in the land and be at peace with everybody. So, yeah. You say that's the point of conflict. You want to look at a couple maps. I want to start clear back. And by the way, I did more work editing down to which few maps I was going to show than to show all of them. But I made these a few years back. Can you see those? Because I can't. My eyes are getting old, and I don't like wearing glasses when I preach. It just bothers me. And so this is sometime around 1250. Why didn't I start at 1800? Because the Hebrew language begins the story about somewhere about 1000 BC was when Hebrew began to be written down. And so before that, you had Akkadian, which was from ancient Sumer over in Mesopotamia, and you had Egyptian hieroglyphs, and there's very little, almost nothing about the land of Canaan before that time. And so up in the northern part, and so if you can orient, I don't know how well you know the Middle East map. I'll use the one on the left. The three main kingdoms of the ancient world. So these are the three earliest empires. One of them was Egypt. Egypt has been around since long. I mean, ancient Egypt. It's one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And so actually 1250 BC is about the story of about the time of the Exodus with Moses. But Egypt had been around for a long, long time before that. The other nation was whoever was ruling Mesopotamia at the time. And so these were Assyrians. Does it say Assyria and Babylonia and Egypt? Assyria and Babylonia. I should have said the Assyrians and the Babylonians because they were more people groups than like a nation. And just because they're color-coded, they didn't have hard, fast boundaries. Like I could fast forward the needle 10 years and the boundaries would be completely different. And there would be people groups. All of this was wide open ranges with people moving and intermarrying. And some of them had, kind of static ethnicities. But there was a lot of trade between these people. And so these people were more or less Semitic people. They were descendants from Shem. And so they were kind of either related or they were cousins. They weren't like, you cross from here to here and now all of a sudden you've got a completely different people group. They intermingled and they shared. This stretch right here is what we know as modern day Israel, or sometimes modern people call it Palestine. Way back in the ancient days, some of the earliest words that we have is Canaan. And that was an Egyptian word for colony. And so you notice something strange about this? And this is one question that modern historians have about, like the Exodus story, is we always have this picture that Egypt is down here where the modern thing is, and then they went up here to Israel and wandered down in the Sinai Peninsula for a while. But even up here in Canaan, that was still kind of considered part of Egypt. And so the earliest parts of the story was when up in this area there were city-states, all up in the call this Egypt North, and there were city-states like Megiddo, which is the Battle of Armageddon, or what else they have all along. Some of the oldest ones are Jaffa, where Jonah sailed for. Another one is up north of the Sea of Galilee called Hatzor. And how do we know all of these? Well, I didn't bring them tonight, but I'll show you. From about the 14th century BC, we have a bunch of letters. So how can you have letters from 1400 BC? Because they're on clay. They're little clay tablets like this big, and they're in, thank you, and they're written in cuneiform. So they came from Egypt, down here where the capital was Amarna, and they go back and forth between all the cities up here, even up here and down here. All of these people were writing letters back and forth to the king of Egypt, asking him for more horses and saying, this idiot next to me is trying to take over my town. And he says, if you don't send soldiers next spring, by the time next winter comes, you're not going to have any city up here. And then the king next to him sends a letter back and he says, no, I'm not the idiot, he's the idiot. He's the one that took that city from me, and we need more horses. And please, can we build another temple? And we have a bunch of these little letters about like this, clay with cuneiform on both sides. So cuneiform is the writing that was invented by the Mesopotamians, but it's written in a dialect that we call Canaanite. So it's fascinating. Even before the Bible began to be written, we have evidence that in the earliest ages, before this belonged to anybody, it was kind of just an extension of Egypt. Those people in Canaan, some of them were city dwellers. And why I say they were city-states, because the idea of having like a state and a county with boundaries and all that, back in the ancient world, most of it was like the city of Tyre. If you were within horse ride of the city of Tyre, you don't mess with the city of Tyre. They just defended their city. And at one point, several of them made an alliance against this one king, and they all kind of chose sides, and then they wrote back and forth. But this is the earliest version of what was happening in Canaan. It wasn't called Canaan yet. That wasn't an official title. When the Egyptians talked about the northern section, it's just like Baja California, right? This area that's present-day Canaan. That's my favorite word for it, by the way. It means kind of like the colonies of Egypt. The people over here in Sumer, which occupied Mesopotamia, they called it Amaru, which is where we get the word the Amorites. So we think kind of the Amorites were kind of the people groups that lived kind of in the northern section. And down south in here were the Canaanites, who were basically city dwellers that dwelt in that place. And eventually there were conflicts between those and some people called I forgot the one name. But one of the names in the ancient Egypt is there was a bunch of pirates and brigands that would go and raid them, and they called them the Apiru. And there's some people that think maybe that's the word where the word Hebrew came from, and we have no idea. Maybe so, maybe no. You have to read a lot of books from people smarter than me to decide whether or not. It just sounds so close, it would be cool if that was the early Hebrews, right? But at some point, we have the story of the Exodus, of all the people coming up out of Egypt. And the archaeology tells us as well that at some point, the city dwellers and the country dwellers would fight against each other, and these cities would be destroyed and then rebuilt and then destroyed and rebuilt. And at some point, there was a critical mass of this people group that became the Hebrew people of the Bible that took over and became the dominant culture in that area. Now, that's what the archaeology tells us. Now, we have a much more detailed story in the Bible, but a lot of the stories in the Bible were written several generations after. And so the question that I had at the beginning, where did this whole thing begin? I'd say probably even before we have any records of it. Long before this and long before we know, long before the Amarna letters, there were people fighting over this little sliver of land. So what's so important about it? Somebody mentioned last week, didn't you, that nothing grows there? Does it? There's no oil. Nothing grows there, although modern Israelites are geniuses and they figured out a way to put visqueen under the ground and get water to capture and to grow stuff there. Thank you, Russ. What'd you say? It's a trade pathway. So I said these are the three kingdoms, and also Mysia was forming over here in Greece. But if you wanted to go to here, you went right through Israel. If you wanted to go from Mesopotamia to Egypt to do trade, you went right through Israel. If you wanted to go to Egypt up to Hatti, you went right through Israel. It was the crossroads. It was the Casablanca of the ancient world. Still is. Everybody comes to Rix. You went right through Israel. More than anything else, when you ask the question, why has Israel been the most hotly contested little sliver of land for all of human history? And the reason is because it's the crossroads. It's the crossroads of the ancient world. Everybody goes through there. And so it has become a football. So I'm going to mention a few, but by our modern counts, 37 different kingdoms have ruled Israel. Think of that. How many kingdoms have ruled America? Well, we had the Native Americans that were here before us, and then we had, depending on where you're at, either the French or the Spanish or the English. What's that? Oh, I'll get there. Present day Israel right here, Kevin, goes down about here, like here down to Eilat in the north of the Persian Gulf. So right here, and then up here, and about there, about where you see the green stuff. This is the line right here. This is the Jordan River. That's the Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee. So right about here. And just for geography's sake, that's about the size of the state of New Jersey. Or if this was I-5 and this was the coast, and here's Portland and here's Grants Pass. It's like everything in Oregon west of I-5. I superimposed the maps one day to figure out how big is this. So if Oregon was divided at I-5 and it was just everything between I-5 and the coast, that's how big Israel is. Why does everybody want it? Well, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Now we have the story in the Bible of the divided kingdom. So it's a little bigger. Now you can see where Judah where the 10 tribes of Israel were in this area. Judah was in the south. Jerusalem was its capital. We had those dirty, rotten Philistines on the coast, which, by the way, nobody really knows where Philistines came from, but the best guess is that they were sea people. And at one point, they came and landed in Egypt and on the Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Egyptians hated them. They have pictures of the Philistines, the Philistines. They were like these foreign invaders that came and landed on the coast and caused problems. That's kind of what they are in the Bible too. The Philistines. I like that line that David says. And this uncircumcised Philistine is just going to be like one of them, right? You can hear the attitude out of it. And they lived along the coast, and those cities have been populated since ancient time and destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt. It's hard to tell how many times. But many of those cities are still there, not all of them, but some of them. And so the coast area down here, this, by the way, is where the Gaza Strip is today. So the city of Gaza is a very, very ancient city. If I'm not mistaken, the city of Gaza was one that would correspond in the Amarna letters in the 14th century BC. So that's how old it was. But it wasn't originally occupied. It was a Canaanite city that eventually got taken over by a people called the Philistines.
So is Gaza on the map just for reference, or is it on the map because it was there then?
Oh, it was there then. But Gaza was a city. See, there's Gaza, the city-state. This area now is called the Gaza Strip. In modern Hebrew, it's a part of the nation of Israel, but it's a part that is allotted to Arab Palestinians today, to fast forward. And so, but the Gaza Strip takes its name from the ancient city. That's a modern name. Gaza Strip is a modern name for that area of land. It's named after one of the 5 Philistine city-states. So it's an ancient word, but it's not necessarily tied it back. There's nothing, okay, this is an opinion statement, an educated opinion statement. There's nothing that I know of that ties the present-day Palestinians to the ancient Philistines that occupied the coastland. Other than the fact that if you went to Gaza, there is a Philistine museum there, and the name is a cognate of, the name Philistine or Palestine descends from the word Philistine. But other than that, ethnically, if you were to do DNA tests, the problem is we don't have any Philistines to do DNA tests on because they were wiped out long, long time ago in many of the conquests. So they haven't existed. I don't even think Philistines as a people survived the conquest of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. I think the Assyrians even wiped them out. So what we have today is not a direct descendant of those people. So you can say, oh, this is the same exact thing as David fighting the Philistine down in the valley. Now we've got the Israelites and the Palestinians. It's not exactly ethnically the same thing. You with me? All right, any other question on that? I'm going to move along. I'm going to go through some of these faster than I do others. And then eventually the Assyrians, the first great empire, they eventually took over all of Mesopotamia and became the largest empire in world history. Really the first real empire in human history. So an empire is a people group that rules multiple kingdoms. And so at first Israel was a vassal kingdom, and so was Aram. And they both rebelled, and they came down around Judah. This is where we get all of our great Christmas stories in Isaiah 7, where he says, go stand in your faith. You know, that king isn't going to, and there's those great prophecies about Emmanuel coming and being with you. And they came down, and the Assyrians, against the northern Israel tribe, they annexed Aram, and they subjugated Israel, and all that was left was Judah. And Judah paid them a great deal of money, and they left them alone for a little while. Then the Babylonians came along and conquered all of this. I zoomed back out again. Now the Babylonians conquered everything that the Assyrians had, including all of Israel. And at first, the Judahites paid the tribute to them, and then they refused to pay it. And just once and for all, they destroyed the temple. And they exiled all the elite into Babylon and destroyed it and depopulated northern Israel with people from all over the world, the Assyrians did, and the Babylonians took everybody out of Israel. So where did the conflict start? Who started it? Did it start with the Philistines, or did it start with the Assyrians, or did it start with the Babylonians? Because these are all different peoples. Eventually, after the exile, and I talk about this stuff a lot, but eventually the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and the Persian Empire was even larger. So the Babylonian empires is where we get Iraq, the Iraqi people, and the Persian Empire is where we get the modern day country of Iran. So the Iranians were the Persians. I have a neighbor that walks around my loop, and I asked him where he was from one day, and I said, are you from Iran? He goes, no, Persia. So he still calls it that. But the great Cyrus the Great, this great thing, Cyrus was a person that believed in multiple gods, and part of the way that he managed his empire, he was no friend of the God of Israel or anything like that, but part of how he did it is he sent indigenous people home to rebuild their temples. And so he was no believer in God, but that's how he managed his empire. But the Bible considers him one of the earliest times where we talk about the Lord's anointed. Because from the perspective of Israel, he's the one that sent the people back into the promised land. And once again, a minority of them went back. Most of them stayed in Babylon. But a minority, and thank goodness a lot of them that could write, they preserved the Bible, they rewrote the stories, they rewrote it again in that square font that I showed you. They added some new codes for how to rebuild. They rebuilt the temple. They rebuilt the structure, the temple structure, the priesthood, all of that stuff. They had a king for a little while that continued on in that messianic role of being the king that's descended from David. His name was Zerubbabel, but eventually he disappears from history and we don't know what happened to him. But after a while, so they enjoyed Persian rule. They rebuilt the temples under Nehemiah, and on that, and then then everything settled out and was peaceful for the rest of the time. No, then came Alexander the Great in 333. I didn't put his layer on here, but Alexander the Great, by the time he was in his 20s, had conquered most of the world in just a few short years, and then he died. And his four generals took over the world. They call them the Diadoche because they split it into 4 pieces. And 2 of them you can't see on the map, but the 2 that are pertinent is down here in Egypt. His general called Ptolemy took over that and created the Ptolemaic Empire. And his general Seleucid took over all of this and started the Seleucid Empire. So the Seleucids were Greek. So why is our New Testament in Greek? It's because of Alexander the Great. So the Old Testament is in Hebrew and the New Testament's in Greek. He changed the culture. So part of how he changed it, they called that Hellenization, which is everybody dresses Greek, talks Greek. It was just a Greek culture. And so it was peaceful through several of the emperors of the Seleucid Empire, till a guy came along called Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he tried to stomp out Judaism. He was the original prototype of an antichrist. He forbid them to sacrifice animals, made them sacrifice pigs on the altar, desecrated the Temple Mount, forbid them to circumcise their kids, forbid them to read the Torah, burnt every copy that they could. And then a man named Judas Maccabeus, Judah the Hammer, rose up as a Jewish man and his sons, and they formed a militia and they fought against the Seleucids. So this is the Maccabean Wars. And at the end of that, they took over the Temple Mount and relit the menorah, and that's where we get Hanukkah. So it's out of that. I believe the book of Daniel, even though the story is about Daniel in Babylon, the book of Daniel was written to encourage those people during that Hasmonean War to not give in to this evil king. You know, kind of like we tell our past stories, kind of like how the story of Paul Revere and his Midnight Ride was wrote in the 1860s to encourage people that were getting ready for the Civil War. So Paul Revere was from the Revolutionary War, right? But the story was retold to give them inspiration. So the book of Daniel is encouraging the Hasmoneans to rise up. And then in 150, where am I at now? In 153, so sometime in the 160s was the war going on. Finally, in about 153 BC, this little kingdom, just a little blue dot, this little Hasmonean kingdom became formed. And for about 100 years, have you noticed up until now, there's never really been a season, except maybe during David and Saul for just a short period of time. For most of the hundreds of years in this area, there's always been an empire over them. They've never really truly been autonomous. Most of the kings of Judah and of Israel were subservient to either the Assyrians or the Babylonians. In 153 was one of the very first times that the Israelites, they formed the kingdom of Israel, and one of the first times in history that they were self-governing and they were free. This is where they invented the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the high priest and all the people that were in charge when Jesus came along. Sometimes the king was the priest, sometimes the priest was the king, sometimes they were different. Sometimes the high priest anointed the king, sometimes the king anointed the high priest. 100 years came and went. Pharisees and Sadducees arguing with each other, intrigue, bribes, people killing one another off, people getting their nephew in, people fighting over who's going to be the new, I wish I could say it was a peaceful season. And eventually, around 64 BC, they had another civil war and couldn't agree about who the new high priest was going to be. So they just said, I know what we'll do. We'll get the Romans involved. That'll solve everything. And the Romans were like a 300-pound gorilla. They were all too eager to get involved, and they came in and they never left. That's why you don't invite Pastor Mike over for Thanksgiving. He always stays too long. But eventually the Romans took over, and that's the New Testament, right? New Testament, we think it's a long story, but it's really a blink of an eye between about 6 BC and the last stories are about 33 AD in the Gospels. And then you have the book of Revelation and some of the latter books, most of which we think were done by the 1st century. And it ended with, and I'm missing a couple of maps in here for some strange reason. But the next map that should be in here, so this is the Seleucids. I don't have the map of when the Romans took over. And all of these became Roman provinces, including Judea. Judea was the name on the Roman map. So you had Judea, and you had Samaria, and you had Galilee, and you had the different areas of that. And in 70 AD, just shortly after the Bible was written and the Gospels were written, the Jews rose up against the Romans again, and the Romans came in with everything they had under Emperor Nero. Both Titus and Vespasian landed as soldiers, father and son, both of whom were going to be Roman emperors at some point. They were all going to be, they were going to be the next 2 Roman emperors. And they laid siege to this little town for 7 years. And halfway through it, Nero died, and Vespasian, the father, went back to become the emperor, and Titus finished the job. So there's this 7-year period and a 3.5 inch. And I think a lot of the book of Revelation is another one of those historical prophecies talking about that final destruction. And what you had after that, never again did you have a temple. The second temple that they built was burned to the ground. It's never been rebuilt. 70 AD. The second temple was never rebuilt. I've been there. When I went in 97, they didn't have this because it was just all dirt. When I went in 2007, they had excavated down the Temple Mount walls. They've gone down another 30 feet, and you can see them. Giant stones, huge, bigger than that rock out there, tossed off of the Temple Mount, boom, onto the street below, and you can see the dents in the streets from where they did it. Remember when Jesus says, not one stone is going to be left on a stone. He knew it was coming. And they tore that temple down and never to be seen again. And so then the Romans took over, and Rome at first was not very friendly to the Christians, as you can recall. They weren't friendly to Jews either, but other than the few years of persecution, Jews had protected status, but Christians didn't. And so Jews could have synagogues, Christians couldn't have churches. Until Constantine came along. Right around the 4th century, Constantine became the new emperor of Rome. He moved his capital to a city called Byzantine, renamed it Constantinople, and his mother was a Christian. His mother came to Jerusalem and identified a city, a place where she thought was a historical place where Jesus was crucified, and tore down the pagan temple and built a church there. And then she went and built a church in Bethlehem. Those churches are still there. We're going to go see those when we go to Jerusalem. And they were rebuilt by Helen. And Helen led her son Constantine. I'm going to say this in broad terms. The story is Helen was the one that influenced Constantine to legalize Christianity in Rome. Some people say that Constantine was the one that Christianized Rome or made Christianity Rome. That's a misnomer. All he did was stop the persecution. He made it legal according to Roman law to be Christian and to build churches. And so we began to build churches. And it wasn't until there were an emperor subsequent in about 467 that finally made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so, where did the conflict begin? What can go wrong now? So now all of this area, all of this, starting about here, all of this is Roman. The Persians took this back over, but all of this is Roman. And this up here is Europe. It all became Roman, and it all became under the Roman Empire. And more there was a split between East and West. And the Western Roman Empire more and more spoke Latin, and the Eastern Empire more and more spoke Greek. And they split, and then they split theologically, and then the Goths came in and conquered the western half. I said I just missed a bunch of maps, didn't I? And I said I was going to go fast. It's like a fire hydrant, isn't it? Because I want to get all the way up to where I think it started. And it's just, I think. But any one of these, couldn't you point to any one of these and says, well, that's where it started, was under the Seleucid. And so by the time we get to about 610, and I just fast forward a bit, didn't I? 1, 2, skip a few. 610 AD. So now what's happened for all of these years? Here you have the Western Roman Empire that's been conquered by the Goths, which are the early German people. So these are the Western Romans. They're not really an empire anymore, but the Eastern Roman Empire, historians call it the Byzantine Empire, and they named it after the town that he called Constantinople. Back in those days, nobody called it the Byzantine Empire. They called it the Roman Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, and they all called themselves Romans. But you know, just like World War II wasn't called, or World War I wasn't called that during World War I. It was the war that ends all wars. So this is the Roman Empire. These guys were irrelevant. England, France, Italy, they were not relevant yet. They were a bunch of tribal warlords. So you had the Byzantine Empire, which was not Catholic, but Orthodox. So Catholic and Orthodox split over just one little phrase in the creeds. Don't get me started. But they were it's basically sister religions that didn't like each other. And all you had left was these two superpowers. Anybody remember the 80s? Who were the superpowers in the 80s? There were only two left after World War II, right? There was the United States and the Soviet Union, the USSR. Those were the days I grew up in. The two great superpowers. I don't know if you call it that. Russia's still important, but there's really, in my mind, there's really only one true superpower. But there were two superpowers. And everybody was you were either on the communist bloc or you were on the West. You were either part of NATO or you were part of the Western bloc. You with me? And then there was the third world, who didn't belong to either one of those. That's where that phrase came from. But for many hundreds of years, the two superpowers was the Byzantine Empire, which, so Israel, or Canaan is right here, once again. All of Egypt, North Africa, the Middle East, this is modern day Turkey, Greece, all of this, Southern Europe, all of this was Byzantine. It was Orthodox. It was Greek Orthodox Christianity. And over here you had the Persians, who were Zoroastrianism. Anybody know who was Zoroastrianism? Which was what Freddie Mercury was. That was the religion of the Persian Empire. And they fought and they fought. And they wore each other down, just like we finally did to the Soviets, right? They just fought, and generation after generation would go and fight and lose a whole generation and have to replenish and go fight. Anybody ever played the game Risk? What happens when you let your turn go too long? You get too thin. And then the next time they come in and just wipe us out. Well, down here on the Arabian Peninsula, you had other people groups that were called, wait for it, Arabians. Enter the Arabians. Notice how late in the story we are? Enter the Arabs. The Arabs were just nomadic tribes. They weren't a nation. They were all over the Arabian Peninsula. They were city-states. They hated each other. They were always fighting. They didn't agree about anything. They sometimes, depending on who could give them a favor or give them enough money, sometimes they would fight on the side of the Byzantines against the Persians. Sometimes they fought with the Persians against the Byzantines. Just depends. And in about 610 CE, Christian era, or AD, whatever you want to call it, there arose an Arabian prophet that, according to his story, while he was in a cave, was visited by an angel and began to get revelations. And these revelations were based on the Bible. They were based on borrowing some of the ideas from the Old Testament, borrowing some of the ideas from the New Testament, not all of them, just kind of taking like bits and pieces and recreating a new religion called Islam. And it wasn't written down. He spoke them over a period of several years. And his teachers would memorize them and pass them down word of mouth. So at first, the Quran, he never wrote the Quran. It was just verbal. And that's what happened with a lot of scripture, by the way, too. It was verbal for many generations before it was written. But he began to take over. Some people wonder, well, why are there verses in the Quran that are violent? Well, because not only was he the prophet, but he was also the general. And so he was not only the Jesus of Islam, but he was also the George Washington. So he also gives instructions on how to fight. And by the way, I don't know if you've read the Old Testament. It's pretty violent too. So how do modern Muslims do it? They do it like what we do with the Old Testament. Well, it's a spiritual war, you know. But here's how important he was, and here's how important he still is. And not to me, I'm talking about how important he is to the Arabic world, and then by extension also to the African world. Is because for the first time in human history, they weren't just getting kicked around. For the first time in history, they organized. And they organized under a flag of a new religion that stressed purity, that stressed devotion, that stressed submission, that stressed prayer 3 times a day. And by the way, if you've ever seen their architecture and seen their mats and seen how they bow down 3 times a day, they stole all of that from the Byzantines. So aren't we familiar with it? Well, because the Byzantines got wiped out. But a lot of the style of Muslim worship and prayer and all that stuff was, first it was Christian. And so here's what happened. Here's where the map is going to move fast. Are you ready? So by the time Muhammad is done, he'd taken over the Arabian Peninsula. By the time Abu Bakr, who was his second, they had taken over the entirety of it. And by the time the third caliph, whose name was Omar, taken over, they'd taken all of Egypt and all of Israel and the southern part of the Sassanid Empire. And Omar is interesting. So before that, in all of those battles, notice I just skipped a few years, but it's only, 14 years later? This goes so fast. But if Muhammad is the Jesus of Islam, Caliph Omar is the Apostle Paul. He really was brilliant, just objectively. He was really brilliant and educated and a master of negotiation and a master of language. And after about 300 of the teachers got killed, the ones that had memorized what Muhammad had said, he made them write it down, which is called the Quran. And here's his story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm going to, because it's an important story, right? You never know, because when you're writing a hagiography, you know, the story, you always make people seem like a saint. But when Omar came up to Jerusalem, which is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was that Constantine's mom built, by the way, which is where St. Helens gets its name, after Helen, long down through a long history of it. But when Abu Bakr got to the front door of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, this big giant cathedral, to honor the place where Jesus was crucified, the patriarch went out and invited him to come in and pray. And he said, no. He said, I don't want to desecrate your holy place, and I don't want to be at enmity with you. And so he knelt down and he prayed in front of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And now when you go visit it today, right across the street of the door is the Mosque of Omar, to commemorate that. So there are stories in the history, not only so that one's between Christians and Muslims, but there are also stories between Muslims and Jews and Christians and Jews. There are stories of great wars, but there are also little anecdotes like that where people got along. So it's not impossible. How am I doing? I'm almost ready to take a break. Are we ready? When do we end? We end at 15 minutes. So I'm going to take a break right now, and I want you to get into some prayer circles. And I want to ask this question again: where did it begin, and how can we undo any of this? Is there anything so far that's given you any kind of a fodder to know how to pray? How would you pray, Marty?
I just pray that they all get the gospel.
Yeah.
That's the only cure that's going to take care of it all.
Wouldn't it be great if what happened to Omar, once again, if it's true, wouldn't it be great if that happened to a whole bunch of people? If people came in and said, okay, I'm Christian and you're Jewish, but we can be friends. You're Muslim and I'm Christian, and I know a lot of terrible things have been done in the name of Islam, but I've been living next to you for a couple of years now, and you seem like a really peaceful, decent person, right? Now, we don't pray the same way. We don't have the same belief system, but, you know, ultimately at the end of it, the God that he's praying with, which is Allah, it's not a different God. It's just the Arabic word for God. In the Christian Bible, even in the New Testament, when you get to the word God in that Bible, it says Allah. That's the word. And so it's like the word Elohim that I shared. And so how can we get along? You think there's room in the world today, or you think it's too far gone? Hard saying, huh? I'm going to put a comment in it. Would you find about 2 or 3 people tonight and take just a few seconds to talk about how do you think you want to pray tonight? And if not, I just want to pray. Can we pray a little bit? All right. Here endeth the lesson. Let's have some prayer time tonight. Find 2 or 3 prayer partners with me. Turn around and find 2 or 3 people and talk about it. Say, how do you want to pray? And say, well, I want to pray for this. I want to pray for this. And divide it up, and let's just spend some time praying together.